ever do is complain. So last Undercards video I talked about Gemstones a little bit at the end of the video, and how they very suddenly changed my opinion a little bit on the meta, and I thought some serious nerfs were needed. So I'm not gonna lie, I don't feel like some serious nerfs were given. I will give credit where it is due to the developers. I did not realize how much Perseverance did help the deck. I was open to the possibility that Perseverance was the problem, but I thought it was very unlikely to be true. However, I have to admit that I think it was very much right now, having seen that the deck is still very much functional even with the nerf to Perseverance to, well, nerf them. And technically, although they were less common, there were other variations of Perseverance decks with similar game plans that were really just as unfair. So props to the developers there. But as for the nerfs we got, they were not very strong. The first changes to Perseverance themselves, where basically their passive got changed so that the KR they give to the highest attack enemy monster every single turn is not permanent. The first time they get hit, they will take the 1 extra damage, but then they will lose KR. Although weirdly enough, this does not revoke the -1 attack. So this does mean that now you can give the same target -1 attack multiple times, but obviously that isn't really super relevant, so I'm not going to have a go at the developers for that. As well as that, now the extra damage will trigger regardless of whose turn it is. And as I say, I will admit this did more than I thought. I really didn't think it would do much at all. But I will say that I think this deck went from literally uncounterable to you could just about do it if you really tried. Mostly because, obviously, with this being an aggressive burn deck, the kind of thing that should be countering this is a healing mid-range deck. But those just simply didn't work, because all the big minions that mid-range loves to play to beat aggro out obviously would just get melted by KR. Now that doesn't happen so much, and actually I will say that big taunts are a genuine threat to the deck now. Yes, you can get past taunts with your spells, but usually your ice caps are the last kind of bit of damage you need to get the kill. And if the ice caps can't get through, then yeah, taunts can actually stop you from winning. I would highly recommend, if you're running into too many gemstones and struggling to beat them, that you run Blue Seed Artifact. Although, again, that's not a catch-all still, you could still definitely lose to the deck. The other change was siphoning. And yeah, siphoning was kind of a stupid card. I wanted to talk about it in my video, but I mean, that video already had way too much in it, and if I had to talk about siphoning, I would then have to talk about Perseverance themselves, and then the video probably becomes over 90 minutes long. But I did realize that siphoning was definitely overpowered. What I didn't realize is just how important it was to the deck. I kind of thought, oh, this is just a card that we put in the deck because it's good, so nerfing it is gonna, yeah, nerf the deck, but it's not gonna be too difficult, we're just gonna replace it with another card. But I have to admit, it was more important to the deck than I realized, because of course, if you play a Pickaxe and then play a spell to make it attack instantly, it's a little bit awkward because you can't actually target your Pickaxe with that spell because it has transparency, which applies both to you and the opponent. And the workaround for this was the fact that siphoning, even though it could buff the Pickaxe and was a spell, technically the thing you were targeting was the thing you were sucking the power away from, the enemy unit, which meant that you could play a spell that buffs your Pickaxe at the same time as killing an enemy, at the same time as giving your Pickaxe haste. Which of course made siphoning really, really good. And even the nerf version is still very good, I would say, in this deck. I do only run 2 copies of it now, it doesn't give the attack buff, but I absolutely still think it's worth running. I honestly would roll 3 copies if it weren't for the fact that only giving health does mean that if you don't get an engine in your hand, like some kind of card that generates value, and you draw a whole bunch of siphons, then obviously that sucks because you don't really have a way to threaten the opponent. You can surely put a bunch of minions on the board that are going to stick really well, but it's not very fast, and, well, this deck wants to play fast. Otherwise, I would definitely run 3 siphonings. But there is one last nerf. Did they do it finally? Did they finally nerf Pickaxe? Nope. They nerfed Stalagmite. I mean, I won't lie, this probably should have been nerfed too, but I feel like this is one of the most irrelevant nerfs you could make. That sounds a bit mean, but I do think I have to be blunt here. At the end of the day, for a card like this, the difference between 2 health and 3 health does not matter that much. In fact, in certain conditions, this is literally a buff, because sometimes it can give you lethal because it allows you to kill your own stalagmites with just 1 gemstone to get the 2nd gemstone if you needed that for lethal. Whereas before, when it had 3 health, you couldn't kill it with 1 gemstone. Honestly, as much as I don't like this deck, I wasn't super on board with the idea of nerfing stalagmite just because it feels like there is no relevant way you could do it. Unless you maybe like made it a 2-drop, but then I feel like that's not the point of it. The only relevant nerf I could think is making it a 1/1, but one of the only reasons that would be relevant is Justice. So yeah, no nerf to Bag of Goodies, no nerf to Pink Crystals, and no nerf to Pickaxe. Now, if you've been playing ranked, you might think I'm being melodramatic. To be fair, there really aren't that many people playing crystals in ranked. And I'll say that I'm happy about that, but I feel like that's just because people know the deck has been nerfed, they're like, okay, guess I'll play a different deck. Personally, I really feel like if people were like super tryharding, we'd still be seeing Gemstones. And while I'm not saying that I want people to be like that, it definitely could happen in a week or so later into the season when people are actually worrying about getting a higher rank, but suddenly everyone starts realizing, oh wait, Gemstones is still really, really, really damn good and I can just climb with this. It seems for the most part that people are just not playing Gemstones because, well, they're trying to have fun with other decks. And I mean, that's what I was trying to do at first in this season as well. You can see it didn't go very well. Meanwhile, you see that Perseverance win rate? Yeah, for the sake of being convenient for me keeping track of my win rate, I have played nothing but crystals with Perseverance this season so that I know my crystals win rate just by looking at that. That is a really goddamn high win rate. That's literally higher than the win rate I had with it last season. It did feel a little bit rough playing the deck at the very start of this competitive season, because I did test it out a little bit just because, well, I wanted to see if the nerfs really affected it, and I'll admit, it seemed a bit rough. But now that I've kind of gotten used to this slightly different way of playing the deck, you can see it's doing better than ever for me. I had mixed feelings about this. I must admit, I started having more fun with this deck when I've been playing it more. I kind of said that I didn't like playing it before, and it does kind of feel dirty playing it. I do keep thinking, damn, this is unfair. But to be fair, I would be lying if I said I didn't start to enjoy the deck. I will say it's not as brainless as I thought, but I also think it's so good you could still get a pretty good win rate with it even if you did play it brainless. Anyway, this is a really long starting segment. I'm going to talk about all the cards in the deck and why I have them this way, because this is not the normal list, so to speak, but I've messed around and I think this might be the best version of this list for this meta. Oh, and just for full transparency, I will admit that this screenshot is the highest percentage win rate I ever had with the deck at any point during this competitive season. It is actually not my current win rate, but, well, there's my current win rate, and although it is lower, it's still above 80%, which is still crazy high. Of course, it's gotten a bit lower because now I'm having way more games at Legend, and obviously if I'm playing people at Legend, I'm going to be going against better players. But as you can see, even when I'm getting matched up against the kind of people that you get in Legend, this deck is still steamrolling through 4/5 of all players. This deck runs both Poke and Noodles. Poke is an artifact that I'm pretty sure you get for free at the start, so you should all have that. At the start of the game, deal 5 damage to your opponent and reduce their maximum health by 5. Might not sound very impressive, but at the end of the day, the win condition of this deck is hitting your opponent with so much direct, unavoidable damage that, well, they die. And just having that extra 5 health missing at the start of the game often is what you need to push them over the edge. The other one is Noodles, and I would say Noodles is one of the best artifacts in this game, to be honest, even though it doesn't sound very strong necessarily straight away. Noodles will shuffle 2 instant Noodles into the top 8 cards of your deck at the start of the game. Instant Noodles is a spell that gives a monster +2 attack, +2 health, and draws you a card. This card is really good, not only because buffs in general are the best way to go with aggro in this game, but also because of the fact it's a 2-cost spell, which means that it triggers all the shock effects of the other cards in your deck, and then on top of that, it draws you a card, so it lets you search through your deck even more for more pickaxes and more pink crystals. Any deck that cares about the board early on should probably be running Noodles as an artifact, unless they have a legendary artifact that they need for the deck, or 2 common artifacts that are absolutely crucial. You could certainly make an argument for replacing Poke with another artifact, but I just don't feel like there are that many that are important to do that with. Parachutism is definitely a consideration. The board control is probably a little bit overkill, but just having other little 1/1s on the board might help you out sometimes. It does work well with your passive, but again, I don't think you really want it more than you want Poke. You shouldn't need a draw artifact because you're going to be drawing enough cards with this deck for the most part. That rules out draw, ambition, and recruitment. And the only other artifact I've really seen people running this deck with is either Mines, which is something that I tried in the past, which, don't get me wrong, it works, but this version of the deck is better if you want to try hard. And weirdly, I've seen a decent amount of people running this deck with good food, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm going to be honest, I think that those people don't fundamentally understand what this deck is doing. Like, yes, it plays a whole lot of spells, and that means you get a whole lot of healing from the good food artifact, which gives you a card in your deck that instantly casts itself when drawn that heals you for 2 whenever you draw it. But the problem is, you do not need to heal with this deck. The only time with this deck you should need to heal is if you're in a mirror match. So I guess maybe they were teching it in for the mirror, but I absolutely don't think that's worth it. While it certainly helps in the mirror, I think not having poke would actually mean that you are overall still at a disadvantage. So first, Stalagmite. I'm going to be straight up with you. The nerf changes nothing. You still run 3 of these. I really think that reducing its health by 1, I don't know if it has ever mattered for me yet. It almost, as I say, feels better because it's easier to kill them on purpose for the gemstone. To be fair though, even before they were nerfed, I was considering that maybe I would cut them from the deck, or at least 1 or 2 copies of them. Which might sound insane, they are really good, but at the same time, obviously the best cards in the deck are these infinite sources of damage. And this, of course, is a finite source of damage. And as well as that, it's a 1-drop, which, like, it can be good for tempo, but because of its low attack, usually it's not a super great tempo play. Especially because you have Birdly in this deck, which is a god tier tempo play, and you would much rather play him, and there's 3 copies of him in the deck. You kind of don't need this for tempo. So I did consider removing these from the deck, but I think ultimately you do have to keep them for one reason. I mentioned the thing that makes this deck stupid OP is the fact that it is an infinite source of direct damage. I know I keep saying that, but like, that's what's really important. That's the reason why healing doesn't work against this deck, and that's the reason why this deck, I feel, is so strong, but is because as long as it has board advantage, it can just keep on getting more and more damage. And even though Stalactite itself is not an infinite source of damage, Pink Crystals becomes one of the best infinite sources of damage only when you have gemstones in your hand. If you have a pickaxe, that's fine. If you have a bag of goodies, yeah, you can get the gemstone, but it'll be quite delayed. As well as that, you're going to have to be careful not to overdraw. But because stalactites are so cheap and usually are played before your pink crystals will come down, usually as long as you played one in the early game, even if you didn't get your pickaxe like you would have liked, you will have a gemstone ready for the pink crystals you played from a stalagmite that you played on a turn earlier. Also, sometimes it can just be nice to chuck it out there with Birdly if you think that your opponent is running some kind of deck that has very good ways to deal with single targets, either an instant kill or a freeze. Not that it's going to stop it, but it means that you don't literally have no threat on the board for that turn because of it. Then we have Pickaxe. So this should be no secret. This card is the most broken card in this entire game, and you are running 3 copies of it, and this is entirely what makes the deck work. I know I've already complained about this, but again, just to be thorough, this card is literally unkillable on the turn you play it, except with board clears, which is a real waste if you're going to waste one of your board clears to kill this, especially because a lot of the time it's going to be luck-based whether that does happen, because really the only person who can do that is Justice, and they might have to, if there's multiple targets, hope that their passive hits the right thing. Basically what I'm getting at is this thing is unkillable the turn you play it, essentially. Every single damn time it attacks is going to give you more burn and more board control at the same time for the cheap price of only 2 gold, which on top of that you can reduce even more with Birdly. And of course that spell will trigger the shock of even more cards in your deck. And as if all that wasn't good enough, it itself has a shock that allows it to attack instantly on the turn you play it if you play a spell with it. I don't have much to say, this card just carries the deck. The more of the game that you spend with this thing alive on the board and able to attack, the more and more impossible it will get for your opponent to win the game. This thing snowballs quickly to a point where it is literally impossible for their opponent to do anything. The ridiculous constant damage from this thing means that there are very few cards in the entire game that can save you. One of the only cards that can save you is if someone does play Frisk against this deck, when there is a lot of monsters on the board and Frisk gets loads of health, that can completely kill this deck a lot of the time, especially because Frisk has 3 attack and, well, pickaxes have 3 health. All that being said, yeah, pickaxes are still ridiculously busted to the point where sometimes I've still won games after the opponent's played an 18 health Frisk against me. So yeah, I feel like I should say more about this card because of how important it is, but really, I think that's all there is to it. Just remember this is the most important card in your deck, and this is the card you want the most, and don't waste these. In fact, I would generally advise not to have 2 on the board at the same time, if you can help it at least. If you have even the slightest inkling they might have any way to kill everything on the board at once, or silence everything on the board. Then we have Pink Crystals. So I'm not gonna lie, I kind of looked at this card before and thought, you know what, this is definitely a very, very good card, but at the same time, this one maybe isn't so overpowered. It just feels overpowered because of the other cards. But honestly, the more I played this deck, yeah, I'm starting to think this card is almost as bad as Pickaxe. To be fair, without Pickaxe, it would probably struggle to generate so much damage because Pickaxe is what gives them the majority of the gemstones they need to keep going. So it could be that a nerf to Pickaxe would be enough to also nerf this card indirectly. But either way, this card is an absolute powerhouse in your deck. Again, remember, basically your objective with this deck is to get at least one of your Pickaxes or Pink Crystals onto the board nice and early, or at least in a situation where your opponent will struggle to respond. If you can do that, then you're pretty much guaranteed a win already. Also, I'd say just generally, the crystal shards that you get from pink crystals are the kind of things that you should probably keep in your hand if you can help it. If you have the choice between playing gemstones and crystal shards, and there isn't really a particular reason why one is better than the other, you should probably go with the gemstones, because with the crystal shards you have to make the decision of whether you'd rather hit a minion or you'd hit face. Now with this deck the answer is almost always face, but of course it will occasionally be a minion. Good example being Frisk. And now we get to the first one of in the deck, Poison. So this is kind of interesting. In a lot of card games it's bad practice, at least a lot of the time, to run single copies of cards in decks if you can help it. And so it might seem a little strange that I'm only running one copy of Poison. Honestly, initially this was just a decision made because I was experimenting with a Mines version of this deck, which certainly worked, but it just wasn't as good as Poke Noodles. But when I was about to take it out, I actually considered, maybe I do want one of these. And honestly, I think I made the right decision. Your hand size with this deck fluctuates massively. If you get the engines that create gemstones for you, then you are going to have a full hand nearly all the time. However, if you get a bad draw and draw all your kind of support cards and none of your actual engines, then you could have a very empty hand very fast, especially since a lot of the cards that are kind of the non-engine cards in this deck discount. So basically I run this to draw 2 cards, and that's really about it. Usually it's the worst card in your hand, but I still think it's worth putting in the deck regardless, because usually when it is the worst card in your hand is when you're already winning the game. When it's the best card in your hand is when you're going to lose. Now, of course, I only run one copy. If it's something that really helps you come back from the brink, why don't I run more than one? Well, for one, I would say this deck skews more towards having a full hand than having an empty one, so it wouldn't need many copies. But for two, because this is such a bad card when you're already winning, having multiple copies of them could lead to situations where you get really dead hands, especially as openers. So I think just having one in the deck so that you have an out to play to is a good idea. This deck has a few cards that there are not many copies of, which is kind of strange, but the reason for that is, one of the reasons that I started to actually kind of enjoy this deck is that I've realized that even though you can play it small brain and just, go face and probably win most of your games, to really optimize the deck and play it at a top level, it is actually quite interesting how you can change your game plan. The deck is so powerful that you can kind of change up on the fly whether you want to be an aggro deck or a burn deck. Because obviously this deck is both. And as well as that, it's even kind of capable of being a mid-range deck depending on your hand. So I actually think it's a good idea for this deck to run a lot of one-offs, at least for the cards that aren't super important to the deck, because if you draw them then you then have the option to then switch to the game plan they support. Poison supports a slower game plan because obviously it doesn't really do much. It essentially quote-unquote deals 1 damage to a minion and gives it -1 attack, and it draws you 2 cards. It can't hit face, and it doesn't put a minion on the board, so it's not the kind of thing that's going to be killing your opponent. But I've already mentioned, it helps you when you're losing. And of course, if you're trying to play the more combo-y burn version of the deck where you're trying to kill them without caring about what minions are on the board, just by having enough gemstones and charge minions to kill them all in one turn, then, well, drawing cards is going to be more valuable. Then there's Siphoning. While the nerf that removed the attack buff from this card definitely hurts, it also made the card 1 gold cheaper. So it's still absolutely a great card, and honestly something that I want to be a 3 of in this deck. But I mentioned before, the only reason that this is a 2 of and not a 3 of is that if I ran this as a 3 of, I would get so many bricked opening hands. Siphoning is so bad in your opening hand unless you draw a card that works with it. And while when you draw a card that works with it, you absolutely dominate, when you don't, it is so sad. And obviously, if we're going to try hard here, we've got to account for the situations where we don't dominate and try and make those situations where we do win. So not really much to say, just be aware of your positioning so that you can use this in future if it's a good idea. You would rather give the health buff to things like Birdly, Pickaxe, or Pink Crystals than something like Stalagmite. So keep that in mind when you place down your monsters. Of course, as I mentioned, the main use of this card is being able to use it to buff Pickaxe while also giving it the ability to attack instantly. This is really good for wiping early game minions off the board, while at the same time giving you a lingering, strong early game threat. As for whether you care about getting a draft in your deck with it killing monsters, it depends on the matchup. Basically ask yourself this: do I think I can kill this person with just the burn that this deck usually does? In which case you would rather not have a draft. if instead this guy's deck seems like the kind of deck that might be able to counter your deck somewhat, and you're going to have to kind of switch up your game plan, then you do want drafts to see if you can find an out through them. There's the most recent addition to the deck, Waterfall Sign, which is another one-of. Now, since this is the most recent addition, this is definitely the one I have the least ability to really speak about. I obviously think that it's a good card because it's still in the deck, but maybe if I played more games, I'd realize that it's not good for this situation or that situation. Either way, I played a good few games with it, and it seems to have been quite a good card. It's been dead 1 or 2 times in my hand, but similarly to Poison, it's usually been a dead card when I'm already winning. Waterfall Sign is a 2-cost 2/2 that gives a spell in your hand -1 cost, and then at the end of your turn, it gives it another -1 cost. So essentially, as long as you cast the spell that you discount with this, this is a 0-cost 2/2. This card is something that would be broken in this deck in theory. It allows you to pop off super hard in the early game and get disgustingly early kills, and just assume complete board control on like turn 2. But at the same time, it's something that I can only run 1 copy of, because, well, for 1, it's kind of overkill, and for 2, when it's not that, it is a very redundant card. For 1, technically in the deck itself, there aren't that many spells being run. There's only 1 poison and 2 siphonings, and there are no other spells in this deck just being run in the deck. That means that this card actually doesn't have too many things to target unless you've already put something on the board that's giving you gemstones or crystal shards. And of course, this is a 2-cost card. Usually that's not going to be the case unless you pop off super early. And it's not really relevant later on as well because, well, Birdly is just kind of this card but stronger, although of course a little bit more expensive too. So if you wanted to make a hyper aggro variant of this deck where you really just go in at the start, then yeah, run 3 copies of this. But personally, I'm only running 1 copy so that if I get it in my starting hand, I can look at what I have and consider, okay, against this person I'm against, is this a matchup where I just have to fucking go in before they get to do anything? And if the answer is yes, obviously I keep it and I try and high roll. If that's not the case, then I just mulligan it. And that's another reason why I only run 1 copy of it. If I mulligan it, I know I'm not going to get it again. And then there's Bag of Goodies, which, man, it is a testament to the strength of this deck that this is probably the weakest gemstone card. This card is essentially a 3-cost 3/2 that draws you 2 cards, only it's kind of better than that for this deck. It does have the downsides of not actually giving you the cards in your hand until you end your turn, and then you won't be able to use them until next turn. However, the 2 cards it gives you aren't 2 cards from your deck, it's a gemstone and a shield. Obviously, a gemstone is better than a card from your deck. It's one of the best cards in the game, and it's not even a deck card you can put in your deck, because that would not be fair. And shield is definitely better than an average card, because, well, buffing monsters on the board is really strong in this game, and even if it wasn't, this card also draws a card as well as doing its effect for only 1 cost. I think it's pretty safe to say it'd be better than the average card in your deck. So what's wrong with this card? Well, I say that, again, it's still a really good card, I'm still running 3 copies of it. But what is the problem with this card? The main problem is that it's too slow. Yeah, I said it. A 3-cost 3/2 that draws you 2 cards, essentially, is too slow. Because you can't play the cards immediately. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still absolutely worth running a bunch of these in the deck. You could certainly make an argument to run 2 instead of 3, but I don't think there's any world in which you go down to 1 or none of these. At the end of the day, you need gemstones to activate pink crystals, and pink crystals become just about as deadly as pickaxes if you have gemstones. And if you have either of those things, you are going to win the game. As well as the fact that shield not only lets you push your already established on-board presence, which you're going to have because you're going to gemstone everything that your opponent plays, but on top of that helps you search your deck by drawing more cards, you know, to find your other pickaxes. So yeah, maybe a 2-of if you find that this card is a little bit too slow for you or you keep overdrawing with it, but personally I think a 3-of. We of course have the classic 3 copies of Ice Cap, because even a 3-cost deal 3 damage is actually a really good card in this game because of how good direct damage is in this game. These are often going to give you the reach you need to end out a game, and probably the only weakness of them is how I mentioned that now that KR isn't a permanent effect, taunts actually can stop you from getting lethal now if you're lethal dependent on Ice Caps. They're the extra reach you need to close out games sometimes, and they actually have a decent amount of synergy with the deck as well. 1, because of Mio-Mio-san, who we'll get back to, and 2, because of, well, Noodles. Noodles is best played on a card that's already ready to attack. If you have a pickaxe on the board and you want to give it haste by using Noodles, you can't because it has transparency. So a lot of the time you'll have to play a monster down and then put the Noodles on it. But if you do that, you often have to play something that isn't ready to attack and give it the buff, which isn't necessarily the wrong play or anything, it depends on the situation, but it's not ideal. Now, although you won't always be able to afford to do this early on, Ice Cap is one of the best targets for Noodles because obviously you can just play them and instantly attack with them with the buff. You don't have to worry about them getting ready for a turn. So this is where things get a little bit spicy. I'm running 2 copies of Date Alphys, which is a card I don't think anyone has been running in these decks from what I've seen. It's definitely a strange one in this deck, but it has been doing pretty well for me. I mentioned before that one of the only things this deck seemed to struggle with was big taunts, or cards like Long Sink, but Day Alphys really helps with that. First of all, because it obviously has synergy with the pickaxes, because you can get 2 attacks from them in one turn, so that you get more gemstones, which might be enough to kill the big units. But then, most effective actually, which wasn't even what I was expecting, is using it with Birdly. Birdly's a big chunky unit that can usually attack into something, kill it, and then still live himself. And I have already had quite a few games since adding this card where I've started to lose on board, and I've actually started to panic and think I might have lost this game, and I just save up my gold a bit, and then get the ability to just Birdly, Noodles, Day Alphys, smack it into one of their units, destroy it, get my second Day Alphys down, attack again, and now the board's just completely mine. Again, with me trying to optimize this deck, I'm really trying to focus on covering my lose conditions. And I mean, this can kind of apply to any deck, but with this deck especially, your lose condition is losing control of the board. Once you are on the board, you have complete control and the opponent is at your mercy. But if you struggle to get a start on the board, or your opponent lands a really nasty board clear on you that leaves you with very little, sometimes the only thing that can bring you back from the brink of death is a Day Alphys sending another unit directly into one of their monsters so that you finally have some board presence, so that you can then start playing your pickaxes and pink crystals and they're not able to kill them because they still have to deal with your 2 units on the board that are relatively large. That's not to say that Day Alphys doesn't have their weaknesses in the deck. They can be a very dead draw, especially if you get both of them, and they're definitely the absolute top end of this deck for the most part. Even though they're not technically the most expensive card in the deck, you don't usually play them once you get 4 gold, you usually play them in combination with another card, but as I say, that card is usually something like Birdly, which is obviously a 9 gold combo. So this is the absolute top end of the deck, and ideally you don't really want your games to go on that long in the first place, so I understand if some people find this a questionable inclusion. But again, the ideal situation will not always play out, and I'm trying to make this deck to cover the non-ideal outcomes so that this deck can win more often. And if my win rate with this deck gets high enough, then you'll be forced to nerf it. Now, all that being said, I mentioned before, the fact there's 2 of them means you can get some dead draws early on. Now personally, of course, it's a little bit hard to judge because there's always luck involved with it, but it seems like as long as you're smart with your mulligans, majority of the time, it's not a problem. But if you find that when you play this deck, you keep getting 2 Day Alphys in your starting hand and it keeps just being a complete brick that you can't really start the game with, then, you know, go ahead and maybe take 1 out and just keep 1 copy. I forgot to even mention the reason I added them into the deck in the first place is because they got buffed recently to have 5 attack. Now while health is certainly more relevant than attack, the 5 attack is nice because I already mentioned that you're usually playing a rather high health unit with this, and of course the fact that it's smacking into something also means that your opponent is less likely to have something on the board that's ready to kill it. And that 5 damage is really game winning. When you've got a deck that already knocks your opponent's health down by 5 at the start of the game and then has lots of ways to deal unstoppable direct damage, landing that 1 5 damage attack honestly usually tips the game massively in your favor. Most versions of this deck don't run any legendaries, but my version runs 1, and it's probably one of the only cards in the deck that I don't know. Honestly, it has felt good to me so far. It's felt like it's good to put this in the deck, but at the same time it feels a little bit unnecessary. I really can't figure out if this card belongs in this deck or not. Either way, I urge you to try it out and make your own decision about it. The idea behind putting Mio-Mio-san in this deck was, well, it's already got good stats for a cheap cost, it's one of the cheapest legendaries in the game, and it puts more stats on the board. Even though it reduces the stats of something, it's halving them and summoning a copy with the stats rounded up, so if you had an odd number, you will overall gain stats on the board. As well as the fact that I think generally this deck is good when it splits out its targets anyway. Obviously not if you know your opponent has a board clear, but otherwise I think this deck generally does better when it spreads its targets out so that you can't just kill one of them and be done with it. But I have to admit, I thought that I would be using Mio-Mio-san to duplicate pickaxes because, well, I've been going on about how stupid overpowered they are. The problem with that is that I also mentioned that there are not many circumstances in which it's a good idea to put 2 of your pickaxes on the board at once. Honestly, this would probably be one of the circumstances where you'd rather have it in your hand. So I guess you could maybe try running Mad Mew Mew instead, but I think that card's a little bit too expensive for this deck. I know it's only 6, but like, this deck is very, very low cost. Anyway, either way, what I found was that, yeah, you didn't usually want to use Mio-Mio-san to duplicate your pickaxes, unless that would give you the last bit of damage you needed to win. Even though halving them would only give them -1 health, that put them in range for Strafe if you're against Justice, and that was a common card that is a problem to deal with this in this deck. And Strafe is one of the cards you're kind of worried about when you play this deck, so you kind of don't want to play into it. And of course, in the mirror, if these 2 health pickaxes get KR'd, then, well, your opponent's pickaxe can kill them in one hit. The main thing I actually found Mio Mio-san was good for was duplicating ice caps, actually. It sounded a little bit unnecessary at first. If you duplicate an ice cap with Mio Mio-san, you're only getting an extra 2 damage. And on a 4-cost card, it's like, is that worth it? But I mean, this deck is so desperate for direct damage that, yeah, honestly, I think it's worth it. And it's made more worth it by the fact that it's not like you have to play this card like that. This card can just be a straight up tempo card. It can be used to get the last gemstone you need, as I already mentioned. It can also be used with pink crystals to get more crystal shards, which sometimes, again, that's another thing that lets you get lethal. But probably the best use of it has been with ice caps with noodles on top of that. If you give a noodles to an ice cap and then Mio Mio-san it, you get an extra 3 damage instead. And that's often been the last bit of reach that I've needed to win the game. Even if not, I then have a 4-4, 3-2, and 3-2 on the board, and while that on its own probably isn't super threatening in the late game, chances are if you're making this play, you're ahead on the board. So despite being in this deck for quite a while, Mio Mio-san is kind of the one big question mark for me when I'm like, is this card the best card to put in this deck? I would certainly say if you don't own this card and you want a budget version of this deck, then absolutely just skip on this one. And also skip on the Day Alphases if you don't have them. The pink crystals you will need though. And finally we get to the top end of the deck. 3 copies of good old Birdly. Birdly is another card I was going to talk about, him being overpowered in the other section, but well, again, that video might have then reached 100 minutes long. It may seem kind of unassuming. He's a 5/4/6, and at the end of every turn, he gives a random spell in your hand -2 cost. And he even does have the downside that it's not intelligent in that if you have a spell that already costs 0 and a spell that doesn't cost 0, Birdly still just picks randomly, and sometimes you can try and discount the spell that's already free, which is kind of annoying. So what's so great about this card anyway? I mean, it seems like this deck is mostly cheap enough already, and he on his own is just a 5/4/6. What's so great about that? Well, here's the thing. I think I mentioned this in the other video, but just to be thorough, Undercards is very different to a lot of other card games. In Undercards, just having big, beefy stats is actually really good. There's not many ways to just instantly kill something in the game. Off the top of my head, there's a few cards that everyone can run that kill damaged enemies instantly. There's Jevil, who one of his abilities you can pick from is to instantly kill an enemy, but the enemy is chosen randomly, so unless it's the only one on the board, there's no guarantee it'll hit what you want. And the only other one that comes to mind is Headshot, which is kind of, just this thing. But just putting a big chunky unit on the board is actually pretty good in this game. I know we have Banana now, which is literally better than this, and so far Banana hasn't broken the game. But a while ago, I remember that Glide used to just be a 10-cost 10/10, and they were actually one of the best cards in the game. At least it seemed like it. Again, I wasn't really involved with high ranks at that point, but it seemed like everyone was playing Glide, and I was certainly getting my ass kicked by Glide back then. So yeah, in this game, just having good stats for cost matters a lot more than in a lot of other games where having good stats for cost is okay, cool, but no. So basically what I'm getting at is, I'm not even kidding, you're basically running Birdly as a 5-cost 4/6. Don't get me wrong, the spell discounts are worthwhile, but honestly just the fact he's a 5/4/6 is fine. Don't be worried to play him if it's a good opportunity to just put something on the board. If you're thinking, I don't have any spells in my hand to discount, I shouldn't play him yet. No, just drop him. Your opponent will struggle to deal with him, and he will be very good against any big taunts they might drop. When playing Birdly, you should also probably pay attention to who's going first and who's going second. The player going first will have 7 gold on their 3rd turn, and the player going second will have 5 on their 2nd turn. If you're going second, you can drop a Birdly nice and early. Don't be discouraged if you're going first though, it's still absolutely worth it to drop a Birdly when you're going first, and obviously because of how cheap everything in the deck is, you often will have something else to drop with it, like maybe a Stalagmite, maybe a Pickaxe. But finally, Birdly can be used, similarly to Waterfall Sign, to get some absolutely disgustingly good early game. Seriously, you really want Birdly in your starting hand if you can help it. I would say the main 3 cards you're looking for when you mulligan your hand in this game, if you're playing this deck, is number 1, Pickaxe. As good as Birdly is in an early play, this deck relies so hard on Pickaxe that, yeah, you want Pickaxe. Number 2, Birdly, and those are the big 2 that you really want in your starting hand. And then number 3, I would say, depending on the matchup, would either be Siphoning, but only if you have the Pickaxe. If you don't have the Pickaxe, then Siphoning maybe not so good. Although if you have Birdly, it's not too bad because obviously you can reduce it down to 0. Or Stalagmite. You might not want Stalagmite if the opponent is Perseverance or Justice, or if they're an Integrity deck that you know is running Carousel. Other than that, yeah, you probably want Stalagmite just to drop something down straight away. And again, it can help you to get Gemstones for your pink crystals if you don't draw Pickaxes. Which leaves 1 card left in the deck, and that is Great Door. I'm considering bumping this up to 2 copies, maybe taking out 1 Day Alphys for this. I'll see. This card will essentially pull one of your Birdlies out the deck, and it itself is a 2/3, so this is a massive tempo play. If you're going first, then dropping this on your turn 3 is absolutely amazing. And if you're going second, it also gives you the option to wait until your next turn, where instead of 5 gold, you'll have 9 gold, if you think your opponent is running some kind of deck where if you play your Birdly out, they will just instantly die. This is a one-of that allows you to play this deck more mid-rangey. This card is all stats, and it allows you to tank hits, and it can be very useful in the mirror. It also, of course, gives you multiple targets if you're worried about insta-kills. And also, even though this is a minor effect, I do have to say that I like how this thins the deck. It takes Birdly out of your deck, essentially, because, well, it takes it straight from the deck onto the board. Now, while I was just going on about how great Birdly is a card that drops off hard. At the start of the game, if you play him in the first few turns, it is absolutely godlike. If you try and play him later, unless you use Day Alphys to let him attack instantly, Birdly usually kind of sucks. He is very heavily tempo based. And so if you reach a point where you no longer want to be playing for tempo because you're not going to win that game, and you instead need to be winning with burn, for example, if your opponent's playing a deck that generates a lot of Gaster Blasters, obviously that wouldn't be very good if you're playing these high health units. It's nice that it takes these things out the deck so you're less likely to draw them later. Which is another reason I'm thinking of bumping it up to 2. One of the only things is, like I mentioned, I don't know if this deck should be running 6 cost cards. This deck has no problem filling its hand when it's winning, and it feels like the low cost of almost all the cards in the deck is part of its strength. Now that being said, Door feels like such a stupid good card alongside Birdly that, yeah, it probably is worth running it. But I just want to explain why I'm a little bit apprehensive to go all in and run 3 Doors. Especially because the next thing it pulls after Birdly, if all 3 Birdlies in the deck are gone, is Mio Mio San. And don't get me wrong, a 4/4 is fine, but like, you'd kind of rather not that. And to be honest, I don't want to put more 5-drops in the deck, because again, that makes the deck too slow and too expensive. But yeah, this is basically another one-of for if you want to change your game plan. If you realize that, hey, actually playing all these small minions isn't going to cut it, or if you realize that your opponent isn't going to die to your burn, either because you had a bad hand that made it so that you can't generate enough of it to kill them, or because they have like a super high health Frisk or something, you can then pivot to actually caring about stats on the board, which obviously can give you a much greater source of damage. So that's every card in the deck. I just want to quickly go over 1 or 2 considerations that I dropped for this deck. Worm Infusion is like worth considering, I guess. It's an instant 1 damage if you've already got something on the board, and while that's only 1, sometimes that's all you need. And as well as that, on big chunky units like Birdly, you can get some super big value by obviously healing them up. And of course, the healing isn't actually so bad, even though you are an aggressive deck, because maybe if you're playing a mirror, you actually want that healing. All that being said, this card feels like too much of a dream, so to speak. I feel like too many things have to go right for this card to be worth running, and overall it's just so niche, I wouldn't try it. Bomb is another card that I used to run in this deck. I used to run 2 copies of it even. Most people didn't run this card, but I ran it just because it was an extra 2 damage that sometimes was the reach that I needed to win, and if they didn't kill it, then obviously it would explode and deal 2 damage to all their monsters. Only it would usually be more than 2 damage thanks to the KR effect, and I basically ran this because I felt like back before the nerfs, the only thing that could beat this deck was a deck so stupidly aggressive that it could actually get onto the board faster than this deck. Like decks with basically nothing but 0 and 1 cost minions. And to be fair, even though I didn't run into those decks much, I did run into them once or twice, and they were one of the only decks that managed to beat this. So I basically was running bombs as a counter to those. Now though, I've already mentioned, I think the best bet if you're going to try and counter this deck is mid-range, and well, dealing 2 damage to all enemy monsters when your opponent actually only has 1 or 2 really big monsters is not super good. Also, this deck has a lot of ways to buff units that you would really like to use, and of course Bomb isn't really a buff target. Foxhead used to be running these decks, but you don't really see it anymore. That's because, well, it doesn't deal 4 damage anymore now, because again, the KR is temporary. It only deals 3. Now don't get me wrong, they're still fine. I think Foxhead is still, certainly you could run it in the deck, but at the same time, this deck is like really tight. Like, why are you running it is the question. If you genuinely have a good reason why you want to run it, then go ahead. But like, what is it that you're worried about? If you've got a 3 health unit that your opponent can play early on that you're really worried about, then go ahead and run Foxhead. But if not, then it seems like an unnecessary card to run in the deck. Another variant of this deck I considered was maybe one with Jockington to get a whole bunch of card draw, but I think you would have to really redesign the deck to make that work. With this current deck, I think you would just constantly have a full hand. It won't be worth it. If you redesigned the deck to have 3 Waterfall Titans instead of just 1 though, and really went in on the early game, then yeah, I could see that version of the deck working. I just want to quickly bring up Scarf Mouse as a, this doesn't have any synergy with the deck, but you can run it anyway. I'm not gonna lie, I feel like there's almost no deck where Scarf Mouse isn't something you could put in and it could be good. You're only really concerned about one thing when it comes to Scarf Mouse, which is big taunts, so you can silence them to get around their taunt. But then as well as that, most mid-range decks buff up their units quite a bit, so as well as that you can remove the buffs with it. So yeah, it's not a bad card, but obviously I'm not running any just because it doesn't feel necessary for me to run any. Battle Flies was another consideration for this deck, simply because it's good stats and it's an instant attacker which helps you get back on the board. It might be a good substitute for Date Alphys if you decide that you don't want to run that card. You're almost always going to have a spell for it, and well, it's got good stats and it attacks instantly, so it's basically perfect for this deck. The only thing it doesn't do is generate burn. Biker Lance is a legendary you can sometimes just drop into aggressive decks, but I think he's too slow for this one. I did consider worsening, but it can't hit face. Don't get me wrong, it can be really good for board control, and one of the weaknesses of this deck is that it probably could do with running 1 or 2 more spells in the vanilla deck. But at the same time, while this card does its job well when it's for the purpose you are hoping, when it can't fulfill that purpose, it's kind of just a dead card in your hand. And it's the same story for a lot of the other spells. Really, Perseverance spells do not work well with this deck for the most part. You mostly run Perseverance for the passive and siphoning. And I guess one last strange suggestion you could try is Library Looks. This could allow you to get more copies of Gemstones and on top of that make them free. Now don't get me wrong, that's definitely good, but it's 5 costs, it's not super fast. And on top of that, you're kind of sacrificing whatever other card you're about to draw to get that free gemstone, which again isn't bad. You'd probably rather have the free gemstone, but it'd be better if you got the gemstone and the card. So I think that about covers every single other card I would consider putting into this deck, except maybe Butterflies, but I don't know about that. Again, there's not that many spells in this deck. It can pull the noodles nice and early, but you'll probably get them early enough anyway. You get 2 in the top 8 cards of your deck, so usually you'll get one of them in the first 4 turns, and usually you won't need one until about turn 4 or 5. Actually, a last minute addition, Cogwheel is a card that I hadn't actually considered until now, but might actually be decent in this deck just because I've been realizing a lot of the potentially dead draws are usually the more expensive cards in the deck with the exception of Birdly. So you could run Cogwheel as just a decent stats low cost monster that helps you cycle your way out of a bad hand. Still, since that's all it contributes and it itself could be considered a bit of a dead card, it sounds like it would be a little bit too slow to go into the best version of the deck anyway. But I do have to admit, I haven't tested that out or really thought about it since I kind of just had that idea now, so maybe that would work. And that's the deck. That's everything you need to know to absolutely dominate the rank ladder and get to legend. No questions asked. I also would like to give a thanks to the developers of Undercards because a few of them actually did see the last video I produced and commented on them, and we got to have a little bit of a chat about these gemstone decks. But to be blunt, the reason why I'm being such a tryhard this season and the reason why I'm trying to push this deck that I think is absolutely super unfair as hard as I can is because essentially I found out that this deck is generally quite liked by the developers and they think it's very fun, so although they want to nerf it, you know, they don't want to, you know, nuke it. And I will admit that is a bad habit that just about every card game has, that whenever a balance patch comes out and a card gets nerfed, it doesn't get nerfed to the normal kind of standard of playability. It gets nerfed to, okay, this can never be played again, thank God. But at the same time, it really feels to me like I have to show just how out of hand this deck is. And I mean, hey, if it's not going to get nerfed anymore anytime soon, then I guess I'm just going to have to push that win rate as high as I can until I've made my point. Also, just because of the fact that obviously before now, I hadn't really ever reached high ranks in Legend. Obviously last month I reached a pretty high rank. At the highest point I was in 14th place, but before then I'd only been to Legend once before, I think. Speaking of which, I'm very close to reaching 3rd place in the world for this ranked season, so yeah, I would say this deck has been doing pretty good. Either way, to be honest, I am hopeful for the future because, well, of course Deltarune Chapter 2 came out, and there's no way the Undercards devs aren't going to be making cards about that. But one thing I was a little bit pleasantly surprised to see is apparently that's going to be next month they're doing that. I thought it might have taken a bit longer. So if we'll be seeing new Deltarune Chapter 2 cards next month, then I could see, even if Gemstones are still overpowered, I imagine most people on ladder would pivot to playing these new Deltarune Chapter 2 cards. Again, just for the sake of having fun. And I think in that case, I would definitely join them. As I said, I haven't joined them this time around because I've mostly found the experimentation kind of period frustrating in ranked this particular season, just because, well, I'll be blunt, because it didn't go very well, but also because obviously there's not that many new cards except the banana to work with at the moment. Oh yeah, speaking of which, I did actually make quite a few decks that I planned to make videos on, but a lot of them I just threw away because so many of them were ones that did well at first, and then I'm like, okay, great, this deck seems to work, it's pretty fun, I'm not seeing anyone else playing a deck like this, right, let's start making a video on it. And then as soon as I start recording the footage for it, I start losing all my games. Now, it's not like I can only show winning games. I mean, even for this deck, which was crazy strong, you saw that I did show at least one losing game footage. But I am at least trying to say this deck is playable, and if the deck that I'm trying to show off to you is now losing all of its games, then yeah, probably needs a bit of tweaking. Those decks were a deck where you would resurrect Banana continuously as Justice with Coffins, and you would combine that with the new Justice spell that damages one of your own minions to give it haste and an attack boost, using the whole combo with that and Receptionist to try and get early board control and also discount your bananas to get them down earlier. And as I said, that deck did fine at first. For the first while it had 60% win rate, which is an absolutely respectable win rate. And as I say, as soon as I started recording videos, it started dropping to 50 and then below 50, and it's like, ugh. There was one other deck I was planning on showing, which was a Bravery Soulless Chris deck, which is a combo I wouldn't have really expected to think of, considering I would almost always play Soulless Chris with Justice. But essentially, it was using the ambush spell that Bravery has to pull mystery machines from your hand and let them die off without silencing themselves so that you get loads of Gaster Blasters. Combining that with the spell that kills one of your own units and deals damage equal to its attack to all enemies, and Golden Flowers, only running ambush and that spell, so that every single time you get the option to either get a board clear or another ambush, and you get a whole lot of board control. That deck performed really well at first, although gains were really slow, so it wasn't really a climbing deck. But then overall it dropped off a bit. It still had a barely positive win rate. It was like averaging out at just barely above a 50% win rate, but I kind of didn't want to show it off then because I made this deck more to be a deck to run in ranked, and I wasn't really going to be very happy with it if this deck that's supposed to be good for ranked is just barely good enough to win more games than you lose. Especially considering when I was playing it, I wasn't even at Legend yet, so it probably wouldn't even have a positive win rate at Legend. The last deck that I would consider noteworthy that you haven't seen that I planned on making a video on potentially was, well, I don't even know whether to call it like aggressive or like mid-range or control or whatever, but I had a very unique Justice deck with Mines that just ran a whole bunch of cards that let you get spells outside of your own soul, and the whole deck was a singleton deck with Librarian, and basically the idea is that, yeah, you just play as many spells as you can that are different from each other and get loads of mines in your opponent's deck. And I think that one, it may have just been luck, but when I first started playing it, I actually started winning loads of games with it, even though I just made it for fun. And I even started bringing it into ranked, it started doing really well, and I started considering, oh, maybe I'll make a video on this. And then, of course, same story as always, as soon as I start trying to record footage, I start losing games. I'm like, oh, okay, maybe this deck isn't that good. But anyway, I promise next season I'll have a more interesting deck to show off. But then again, my win rate wouldn't be something like 80%, most likely. And also, thank you for 210 subscribers. I know we've already hit 200, and that was already a surprise. Well, I say surprise. I've been hovering at the 190s and very close to 200 for a very long time. So while I've been anticipating it for a long time, eventually it kind of hit the point where I just stopped even thinking about the fact I was close to 200 because it just seemed like I would never hit it. And it's just kind of funny to me that now I have hit 200. It's not taken that much longer at all to get another 10. I know it's small numbers, but obviously you got to start somewhere. So yeah, thanks guys. But one last thing before I end this video, in case you haven't noticed, I'm very bad at ending videos. I'd just like to let you know that while you probably recognise I used some Undertale and Deltarune music in this video, there's probably a good amount of music in this video you heard that you did not recognise. That's all music made by me, and you can see some music production stuff on my second channel, Technocosm, where I do that kind of stuff. But if you are familiar with Technocosm, you'll notice that, one, the music you've heard isn't on Technocosm at the moment, and 2, it's very different in style to what I usually do. I usually do color-based, dubstep, that kind of stuff, and this is obviously much more, well, video gamey music. Well, I don't think I've mentioned this publicly yet, but basically I hope to make my own Undertale styled game, and obviously that is a big dream, so it's not something I plan to have done anytime soon. My kind of approach is that I'm going to work on it slowly but constantly. So for now, I'm actually not even really coding it at the moment. I'm going to wait until I'm further through my uni course, because then I might pick up some things that are more important to know before I start coding a game like this. So for now, I'm much more focused on getting art and assets done, because that's something I also want to do myself for the most part. So I've been making music for the game, and I've been drawing sprites for the game, and I've obviously been planning out the story. I thought I'd tack this on to the end of this video specifically, because I know that I've got a bit of a new audience now from Undercards, and obviously the people who are watching for Undercards are probably the people who are going to be most interested in me making an Undertale styled game. Can't get into it much here, of course. Even if I did, this video would get another hour longer. That seems to be a theme. But the main reason I bring it up is just as a kind of, but this is a little tester. I wanted to ask obviously if you like the music that you heard, but also if you felt like it kind of fit. Like obviously I'm not trying to make it exactly the same as Undertale style music, but did you get an Undertale-y kind of vibe from it? I mean, who better to ask that than, well, Undertale fans? Anyway, I think I'm actually done now for this video, so I'll see you in the next one. Bye.